Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. Especially since I've spent the better part of this week diving into indie studio Arrowiz's peculiar RPG, Mato Anomalies, which alternates between story-dense segments, dungeon crawling, and a card game. Join me as I try and make sense of its mysteries and discover if I felt this case was worth cracking. I'm your host Arlyeon. Let's find out together. The city's sick. Disappearances and other strange occurrences plague the street, seeming to prey on the desperate and vulnerable, all while the elite bask in the safety provided by their status. At least, until the soft murmurs of discontent intensify. Enter Doe, the detective. What starts as a simple investigation into the elusive item known as Handout soon evolves as the mundane horrors of the city give way to a supernatural threat that seems to underpin everything. The Bane Tide, a supernatural force seemingly posed to consume everything. But Mato is not without its defenses. Bit by bit, Doe encounters those curious few who can oppose the tide in his stead, starting with Graham, the mysterious shaman, and soon cascading to figures who fought in the shadows or had once been consumed by them. But will it be enough to unravel the secrets of the city? Summary aside though, talking about the actual narrative itself requires a bit of unpacking. While it initially starts out as a sort of cyberpunk-themed noir story, it's not long before it sidesteps genres into a weird paranormal mystery. One which is complicated to the point that it takes playing through the full breadth of the game to truly unravel what exactly is going on, and appreciate all the small details leading up to its finale. Suffice to say, it is very story-focused as far as endeavors go, a lot of which is specifically crammed into the segments where you play as Doe. See, when you're in control of him, you travel across Mato hunting down leads, a process which has you talking to the various NPCs in lengthy and frequently consecutive dialogue segments that are attached to the main storyline, the myriad side quests, as well as the companion-related segments. It's to the point that there will be times where it feels like you're playing a kinetic novel of sorts, but ultimately, these instances did help a great deal towards further building up the lore of the world, as well as helping to contextualize events within them and flesh out the characters that accompany your party and oppose it. To the point that I can safely say all of them serve a solid purpose within the story, and I didn't have any regrets for engaging with any of them. That's not to say it's a flawless story. It can start to drag a little, especially when you're chaining a lot of these instances back to back, but again, it does manage to come to a conclusion that I felt was genuinely satisfying. Also, while I have mainly been focusing on Doe's side of things for the story, I will admit that the narrative elements aren't entirely confined to him, since there are some scenes that play out during Graham's gameplay segments, including the collectible journey entries that you can find strewn about the layers. Which, right, it's time to talk shop about the bulk of what you'll be doing when you're not combing Mato for leads, and that's some good old-fashioned RPG-flavored dungeon crawls, given that a number of eldritch layers find themselves discreetly opening up across the city. Admittedly, the dungeon crawls themselves are a fairly straightforward experience, represented as sprawling open corridors culminating in either an elite enemy or a boss at the end of the dungeon, with the added bonus that you'll be able to see every enemy encountering your way, allowing you to either bypass them or butcher them all for much needed experience. Really, the only quirk that you get insofar as the dungeon design itself is the fact that story-centric dungeons will introduce mechanics based on which chapter you're in, such as the searchlights in the second chapter, the laser puzzles in the third, or the heart attack-inducing timer in Chapter 4's story dungeons. But that's only along the main route. See, after you clear a layer, it vanishes, taking all of its goodies with it. So, if you're still hurting for gear or experience, your only real option is to tackle one of the random dungeons. Here's the thing though. While these certainly provide you adequate access to better quality gear, with the added perk of more random modifiers, as well as experience, they feel significantly blander. They lose any of the quirks unique to the chapter's central dungeons, devolving instead into a gauntlet of combat encounters and chest looting. Sure, it tries to introduce some specific elements like the existence of shrines you can encounter which give party-wide buffs, and which don't stack, so don't pick the same one twice, but beyond that, the only real thing you have to look forward to is the simple fact that they get bigger the deeper you go, in tandem with the random dungeon sanity mechanic, which drains sanity as you pick fights and culminates in a significant debuff if you run out. Here's the thing though, if you're clever about clearing a path ahead, you will rarely have to deal with it even when snagging as much treasure as possible, unless you are absolutely going out of your way to do so and neglecting the little sanity recovering shrines the game sparsely provides. Still, even without this, it's not like the game won't punish you viciously for getting reckless, with the largest element being the way HP is handled. See, individual characters don't have a health bar, it's shared between the entire team, which isn't so bad when you're taking individual hits and a tanky character is absorbing them, but absolutely horrible if a character has poor gear and everyone decides to beat them up. That said, the real party popper here is AoEs. They're bad enough in a normal encounter, especially if two enemies can churn them out, since that can savage your health, but bosses also love to use these and they will entirely reduce your progress to a smoldering crater. And while this isn't so bad with story dungeons, which have save points scattered at certain spots, random dungeons don't have these, kicking you back to the start of a potentially lengthy string of walking and fighting. I mean, there are ways to mitigate this. Debuffs and buffs certainly help, as does engaging with the game's gear system to improve your survivability and unlock neat passives by connecting matching tiles together, as opposed to making yourself a pure glass cannon and dying hideously, which wasn't just from AoEs. I also got confused once, and yes, you can vaporize yourself in one shot if you are not paying attention. That's not the only bit of customization you can do character build-wise either, I should mention. Each of the cast has a pair of unique weapons, all of which come equipped with their own distinct skill sets. What's more, they also get a pair of talent trees themed around those weapons, though certain passives overlap. I mean, there's also a talent tree related to a character's ultimate skill, but by the end of the game, Ringless's ability to grant me a barrier of bonus health equal to max HP became my de facto manner of surviving most of the bullshit being flung at me during boss fights. But yeah, that's honestly a lot of what you're doing gameplay-wise. Even when you're pursuing the narrative odds and ends of the side quests, a fair portion of them will either lead to a side layer or a random one, so these are systems you'll need to get very familiar with. Though, well, Dough isn't completely excluded from having mechanics, and this is where the oddness I mentioned in the opening crops up. Remember that card game? Well, in the course of Dough's investigations, he'll occasionally come across potential suspects who decide to play difficult. Which is sort of a shame for them, given Dough's been given the ability to essentially rip through their mind's resistance, provided he can complete an odd deck-based puzzle. And I am being very specific when I say deck-based and not deck-building, since each companion has a deck associated with them, which you gain when they join you, as well as a more complex variant you can swap to after you complete their conversation paths. While you can't tailor any of these decks, you don't need to, as their specific fortes lend themselves to very different strategies, which sometimes prove clutch when trying to navigate the specific mechanics which arise in a given encounter. And I'm not going to lie here, I actually sort of wish that there were more of these in the game, or a way to play through some of these earlier encounters with a different deck, or just, while they do take a bit of adjusting to, they are genuinely neat to figure out. And speaking of neat, it's time to move on to the aesthetics, and Mato's visual presentation style is definitely interesting, if only because of how much variety there is. For instance, the dialogue winds up being presented to you in a number of manners, ranging from basic dialogue to visual novel-esque segments of prose to literal comic book segments with animated panels and some cutscenes squeezed in here and there. It honestly looks fairly nice as a whole, and even when it's just portraits, I find myself appreciating the idle animations. I'll also admit that I was fond enough of a few sequences that I actually hit up the cinema area that allowed me to re-watch them. I mean, yes, there is some weird creepiness in the character modeling since the protagonists have eyes, but a lot of the side characters don't, resulting in this weird facelessness. Also, as a secondary gripe, the UI and the combat in the menu isn't actually the best, if only because the information for your combat skills don't update as you unlock any talents which modify them. It's a bit awkward, really. But I'll forgive it, because it lets me skip animations in combat, which, in a game as combat intensive as this, is an absolute godsend. Like, yes, I definitely still watch them sometimes, but I skipped them more often than not when grinding, especially when I was dealing with some of the longer abilities. Also, you can't actually skip ultimate abilities. That's a weird little quirk there, but it is a thing. Other than that, the only real thing coming to mind is the overall area and enemy design, as you're provided with a solid amount of variety for each of the game's chapters, to the point that I'd occasionally just loiter around and soak them in. Something facilitated by the OST, which I found to be a genuinely solid accompaniment to your very lengthy journey. I'll also have to give some credit to the voice lines during combat. Despite how long the game went on, they didn't actually get on my nerves by the end of it. There's some decent variety even when using the same skill. In any case, this brings us to that final essential question. Did I think Mato was worth it? And ultimately, I'd have to say yes. On the dungeon diving side of things, I definitely preferred the main content versus the randomized dungeons, but I can't deny I had a fair amount of fun engaging with the systems. There's just something immensely satisfying about optimizing my build in order to tackle some of the harder content in the game. Also, I was really fond of the change of pace that the puzzle-oriented card games represented. It was good stuff, factoring in a genuinely interesting story to pursue, and overall I can safely call this game a hit. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks, when I will very likely have a somewhat less noir-sounding voice.